in the middle of no man's land, quite literally. And if you've managed to have a look at your handout, you would have realised I've asked you to read the first 2 chapters of Job, and I'm going to mention some other things beyond that as well, because the lectionary does jump around quite a bit. The book of Job has often been referred to as one of the most difficult books of the Bible because scholars over many centuries, Jewish and Christian, have had trouble reconciling what we consider to be the loving God that we worship with the God that's presented in the book of Job. And part of the problem is while the book appears to support the idea of being righteous, nonetheless, even though Job is commended for being righteous, he suffers for it terribly. So it's starting to question a number of things. And the book of Job's always been famous for a number of things. And you might have heard there's a saying, the patience of Job. And also there's this capital S character, Satan, in there. I'm going to suggest that both of these particular truths are probably not truths. Job is not especially patient. He manages to rant for something like 30-odd chapters.
Yeah.
And nor is the Satan, the personified force of evil that we find in later biblical literature. So what is it about? If it's not about those things, it must be about something, and indeed it is. One of its functions is to challenge the theology of Deuteronomy. We call it the prosperity doctrine nowadays, that claim that righteousness is always rewarded and evil is always punished. The author of Job disagrees, as his experience has shown him that good people have bad things happen and evil goes unpunished among the wicked in what he considers an imperfect world. So this is an unusual setting. It's in the setting of the heavenly court. It's a literary setting, and I'll explain why in a minute. And the author constructs a debate between God and the adversary, who we're going to spend a little bit of time on, and sets the scene for an interesting theological exploration that goes for over 40 chapters, though it's a large book. The book of Job is probably written sometime after the Babylonian exile, though it does have earlier elements in it. And with your notes, I sent out an attachment, which is an introduction to the book of Job written by the translators of the NRSV Bible. And it sets out all the historical data, and it will tell you all the literary features that come from other ancient Near Eastern writings. So rather than try and cram them all into this Bible study session, I thought I'll just attach it and you can read that for yourself if you're interested. It does deliberately avoid any identifying historical features. It's not written as an historical account, but as a fable or folklore encounter between a human being and God. And we know this because it starts with the Hebrew equivalent of once upon a time. And the Hebrew says there was once a man. It's part of the wisdom literature of the Bible. And along with the books of Ecclesiastes, Ruth and Proverbs and Esther, it sits there. Its action, as I said, doesn't take place in Israel. It's in the land of Uz, which is meant to be down to somewhere in the southwest of Israel, around Edom. Its characters are all from Edom. There's Job and all his friends are not Israelites, though the last one, Elihu, does have an Israelite name. And it's thought that it's set in this particular non-Israelite setting to allow a freer discussion of the issues the story raises. Like other books in the wisdom category, Job is a very complex book. It has lots and lots of clever word praise. There's lots and lots of dense Hebrew poetry, and it's full of intentionally ambiguous ideas. Now, I'm going to assume you have all read at least the first chapter, and the second chapter is almost the same. It's just there's different forms of destruction going on. But I want to ask you in the big group now, what are your first impressions of the book of Job reading this first chapter? What do you think is happening here, and how do you react to it?
I guess it's setting the scene of bad things happening to good people.
Yep, that's right. Kate?
It strikes me as a like a fable where the gods are playing with humans, like humans are the puppets and gods are in charge. So that's a very a way of telling story, especially Greek mythology and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Yes, and it was also common in ancient Near Eastern theology. And by
Very
the end of
much
the
a
book,
test.
it
Sorry.
is a test. Yeah, go ahead, Gwyn.
No, that was it.
It's a test. It is a test. And we're going to consider what does it mean to be tested too as we work our way through this. So it's a very difficult book. It's not the way we're used to thinking about God, having debates and bets with his minions about the life of one of his loyal subjects, basically. So we move on to now is who is the Satan? And for those of you who like the idea of a capital S Satan, you're going to be very disappointed because the Satan is not the personified force of evil or the prince of darkness found in later biblical literature, despite the fact that your Bible will have undoubtedly given him a dramatic capital S. It's a common Hebrew noun, and it's generally translated as adversary or enemy or accuser. Occasionally it's advocate. It's found throughout the Hebrew Bible. And I've sent you out an attachment that you should have had at the end of your notes, which we're going to briefly have a look at. And I've called it the translator's capital, the translation of Satan. And I've suggested you look up 1 Kings 5, 4, 11, 14, 23 and 25.
Yeah.
If you have a look at 1 Kings 5, 11 and 11, you will find it's translated as things like adversary and enemy. And if someone would like to check my proposition, that would be good. You can do that now.
Yeah, mine says adversary.
Adversary, yep.
Mine says adversary too. There's no verb or disaster.
Okay. No one has a capital S, Satan?
No.
No. Well, the word is Satan. What about 1 Kings 11, 14?
No, and adversary.
Adversary.
An adversary and no, verse 23?
Adversary.
Adversary.
Yeah, and verse 25?
Adversary.
Adversary. No capital S Satan's there?
No.
No, but the word is Satan. So I'm suggesting to you that the way this should read, and all scholars would agree with me if you're into reading commentaries and such, the word that is translating Satan in Job, it gets this capital S, but it should read, it was the day that the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the adversary also came among them. Because the adversary is not just a Satan, which is an adversary, he's the Ha-Satan, which is the adversary, because Ha is the in Hebrew. So the NRSV, if you've got that in front of you, or other ones will say capital S Satan. So I am putting to you that's not actually correct. He should be the adversary or the enemy. He's not really the enemy. He's part of what's called the Ben Elohim, the sons of God. He's one of the angels, if you like, up in the heavenly court. And he clearly has a job wandering around the earth, and he puts the case for the other side. And we see him doing this in Zechariah, where he's putting the case against Joshua in that particular one. And sometimes he's also known as the accuser for that reason. So the choice of translator to adopt a capital S influences the way we are going to read the text. And you can see I've written it out there. We've got Satan, and that's Satan in Hebrew for you in your handout. And I've also given you some text if you want some further proof of this, of different ways things are translated. And I've picked out some verses from the Hebrew Bible that use this word in various stories of the Hebrew Bible. Now, we're not going to, but we can have a look at the NRSV and the NR and the NIV, which should be on your first page there. And you can see Numbers is particularly interested. God's anger was kindled because he was going, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the road as his adversary. Does anyone know what story that verse comes from?
Oh, Balaam.
Balaam, yes. So God's anger was kindled because Balaam was going, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the road as a Satan. And the word Satan is used. So the angel of the Lord is a Satan. And you can see from Numbers then that this noun is not the capital S Prince of Darkness, because here we have an angel, a Malachim, being described in this way. Now, if you look at the way the NIV translates it in the next section, you'll see that the NIV are not happy about the idea of the angel of the Lord being a Satan, and they translate it differently. The angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. No adversary there. Thank you very much. It's just been eradicated. The other interesting one is 1 Chronicles 21, where again we find the word Satan is given a capital S. Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. Now, David's expecting a war, and so he's counting the men to muster his forces. So I would suggest this should be translated as an enemy stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel, which makes perfect sense. But all our Bible translators, again, give it a capital S. It's not the way it should be translated. And you can see the verse I'm referring to in Zechariah at the bottom, Zechariah 3:1. The NRSV and the NIV translate it as Satan. It should be the accuser in this context, and the accuser standing at his right hand to accuse him, or to, we can find another verb there. And if you look over the next page, the NEB and the CEB both translate in Zechariah the word Satan as the adversary. So that is just to prove to you that I'm not talking through my ears or anything else. In fact, there is a problem here with this particular translation of the Satan, or the adversary, as the Prince of Darkness. Does anyone have any questions about that they'd like to ask?
Me, Elizabeth.
Yes.
Is there some sense here that the adversary is something like the devil's advocate when the Catholic Church is seeking to make a saint, and they appoint somebody to argue the opposite case, why this person shouldn't be sanctified? Is it that sense as well?
Yes, it does have that sense as well, particularly in this setting.
You said that this was written in the land of Oz.
It's
and
set
that
in
these
the land of Oz. It's not written there, it's set in it.
set in it. My question was, why would people who were non-Jewish be trying to prove something in Deuteronomy was incorrect?
You came in late. You did miss something, Norman. I said it's set there by an Israelite author so they can discuss the questions with impunity. By taking it out of Israel, you can discuss it more openly than if it was Jews debating it.
Is there a difference in the way that the translators deal with Satan as so an adversary versus the adversary? Does that make sense?
Yes, he's usually the adversary. If it's one of the Ben Elohim, which we're talking about here, and when he's in Zechariah, but in other places where it's obviously a human enemy, like, King Solomon's enemy, where we saw in Kings, it can be an adversary or it can be the adversary. It's just a noun. So it can be an indefinite article or a definite article. There's no rule about it. But normally if he's got the in front of him, in a setting that's divine, it's the adversary. But if it's in a setting that's not divine, like King Solomon has an enemy, it might be the enemy, or it might be an enemy, or he was the enemy of Solomon. So it's just like any noun. It can take the definite article or not take it. Does that make sense, Matt?
I just looked up NLT and it's covering all bases. It's got the accuser, Satan.
He's not Satan. Let's just throw that down the toilet. There
Satan.
is no heaven or hell in the Old Testament. Let's get that clear. There's no afterlife. There's no heaven for people. God lives in heaven with the Ben Elohim and the Malachim and the cherubim and the seraphim. We know that because different parts of the Bible talk about that, but people don't go there when they die.
I think that's the thing we find the hardest to get into our heads when we're reading this particular book, and especially when it's bringing up the words the accuser, Satan, however it's translated, we're reading it from a perspective that's not there.
That's right. We're looking at it from a post-Christian point of view. The Old Testament has no afterlife.
Yeah.
When you die, you are dead. You go to the pit, which is sometimes called Sheol, but you are a nephesh, and then you are dead, which means God has withdrawn his spirit or breath, and you die, and you go and you're buried, which is the pit or Sheol. You do not go to heaven or hell. So if there's no hell, there can't be a Satan, can there? Because he's got nowhere to go.
So the passage to hook this onto in the New Testament is when Jesus is in the temple and is being confronted and tested by all sorts of people, and the Sadducees put this trick question to him about the man whose wives keep dying and who will he be married to in heaven. The question is put by the Sadducees because they believe the first 5 books of the Bible, and nowhere in the first 5 books of the Bible does it mention the afterlife. Now,
That's
the
right.
Pharisees did have a belief in the afterlife, and they got that by interpreting a couple of references in Isaiah and I think even Job, interpreting it in a certain way as referring to an afterlife. But it's really not foundational Israelite understanding.
No,
And
the
so the
Sadducees were right.
The Pharisees and the Sadducees argued about that.
Is that what Jewish people still believe? Or?
No.
No.
No, they do believe in an afterlife because things develop. There's a whole body of literature called the intertestamental literature between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in the intertestamental literature, you have the rise of what's called apocalyptic literature, and it has an afterlife. But it's not in the Old Testament. So the Satan is a heavenly being, and he is part of all the other heavenly beings. And he obviously has this interesting devil's advocate job, to use what Anne said. So we need to make it clear. We're not dealing with the prince of darkness, the devil, the diabolus, or anything else like that, like you find in the New Testament. Certainly the Satan is evolved to become the prince of darkness by the New Testament, but he's not in the Old Testament. He's something different.
So
And
what we make of Revelation 20, I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key to the abyss, holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. What we to make of that?
What we make of that, Derek, it's in the New Testament, and I've just said the devil is the personified force of evil in the New Testament. I'm just pointing out he's not in the Old.
Well,
No, he's not, Derek. Sorry. That's the end of it.
Hey.
Because the only place we find him in this kind of role is 2 books. It's Zechariah and it is in Job, and he is under the dominion of God in both books. He has to obey what God says, and God has to agree to everything he wants to do. He is not the force of evil we've come to think of as the devil, and it doesn't matter what Revelation says because that's in the New Testament, and people are thinking differently by that time. There's been an evolution of this character through the intertestamental literature. And we have trouble getting our heads around here that theology and characters can evolve. They actually do. They change.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to Job. We're in the heavenly court and we have all the Ben Elohim, the sons of God there. And we have the Ha-Satan, the accuser or the adversary, and up he pops. And so my question to you is, when you translate this as the adversary or the accuser, does it change the meaning or impact of the first chapter? So when we translate the Satan as the adversary, does it change the meaning or the impact of the first chapter for you?
Absolutely, yes, it does change the meaning.
You want to unpack that, Matt?
It means that rather than Satan, capital S Satan, are kind of post-Christian understanding, as opposed to God. To me, it's God and Satan working together.
Yep.
It's just completely changed the whole context for me.
Excellent. That's what we want to hear. Good work, Matt.
Needs to be repaired.
Okay, anyone else?
To me, it's as if they're having a bet, you know, a bet on a possible outcome.
They are.
And God is saying he will remain steadfast. The adversary, Satan, is saying, no, I bet he won't. He'll give in eventually and curse you for his trouble. So it's a sort of a contest between them.
Yes, it is. It is a wager that's going on there. That's quite right. Anyone else?
Well, it doesn't change anything because these aren't events. This is a literary tool being used to explore a theological understanding of, you know, what's going on with good and evil.
That's right. But I asked, does it change how you read it?
No, because for the reason I said.
Because for some people, it clearly will change it, depending on how they read that word in their translation.
Maybe just to add too, it kind of changes how you think about God, not just.
Yes, there is that issue.
Yeah. I find it very problematic that God would do this.
It is very problematic.
It really bothers me.
Yeah.
And that
go on, Margaret.
probably won't be one of the questions we'd explore now, but it does open up a huge line of thinking. It challenges the way we think about God, and that takes a long time to work through.
Yes, it does. God is not particularly nice in the book of Job, not the way we think of God.
No.
But I mean, I think we need to work out which God we're talking about. Is this the God of the Old Testament or the God of the New Testament?
They're the same.
God.
You're stuck with that, Norman. There's not millions of gods floating around the universe.
No, I accept that, but it's
He's
our
evolved.
understanding.
It isn't.
Understanding has probably changed. I think that's right. Hang on, Derek. Understanding has probably changed, but it's the same God. Kate, then Derek.
I was just going to say the whole of the Bible is exploring how humans understand God. Like this is a human story trying to understand the unexplainable. So we're just grasping at straws here to try and figure out why these things happen to people. That's how I see it. It's not defining God.
No.
Are we talking about understanding God, or are we talking about understanding man's interpretation of God and God's dealings with men? Because you know, to give God this sort of character that allows God to allow the adversary to torture Job is not a high view of God, but we're looking at what the way man regards God, aren't we, rather than the way that God regards man?
Well, probably. I think that's a fair comment, Derek. It's certainly been written by a human being who's trying to work out why bad things happen to good people. But it's also trying to look at what they can, if bad things happen to good people, what does that say about the justice of God? So it's raising both those questions.
Yeah.
And what does
And
it
it
say?
is this person's exploration of it. He doesn't have a spy in the heavenly court writing down some verbatim conversation between the Hasatan and the deity. So it is a literary thing, as Bill said. That's right. We'll move on now and we'll look at the patience of Job. And I've pointed out he's not especially patient. Whilst he's afflicted, he spends all his time complaining, and he challenges the injustice that has reduced him to these straits. For example, in chapter 3, we find him crying out, "Why is light given to one in misery and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it does not come, and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to one who cannot see the way, whom God has fenced in?" Job is not happy about how he finds himself and the place he finds himself in. And if Job had known he was a test, if Job had known he was the subject of this wager between the Hasatan and God, he probably would have acted and spoken very differently. But he's not aware of it. He doesn't know what's transpired in the heavenly court, as we, the reader, have been made aware of it. So I had another question there, but it's how are we expect to understand God's role in this chapter? Well, we've covered that in part, so we might leave that and come back to that, because God's role is being set up here as saying, well, very well, go and test him. I know he's righteous, but I'm going to allow you not only to do horrible things to him, but I'm going to allow you to annihilate his livestock, all of his children, and a good proportion of his slaves. And those who survive that, I'm going to have them sold off and sent somewhere else. So it's not just Job who suffers in this. There's Job's wife, there's Job's family, there's Job's household in the form of his servants, all of Job's livestock. They all suffer, and then Job himself in chapter 2, of course, is struck down. So what we're going to look at now, we're going to look at 3.5 minutes from the Bible Project, just on the first part of Job and how it fits into the Wisdom series.
There are 3 books in the Bible known as the wisdom literature: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. The first, Proverbs, showed us that God is wise and just.
Yeah, we learned that God has ordered the world so that it's fair. The righteous are rewarded, the wicked are punished. In other words, you get what you deserve.
But then we meet Ecclesiastes, who observes, people don't always get what they deserve.
Yeah, he said the world isn't always fair, that life is unpredictable and hard to comprehend, just like smoke.
And this makes you wonder, okay, well, is God wise and just?
Exactly. And so it's that question that is being explored in the final book of wisdom, Job.
All right, let's dive in.
So Job begins with a strange story that takes place up in the heavens, which are described something like a heavenly command center. So God is there with these angelic creatures called the sons of God, and they're all there reporting for duty.
And God points out this guy Job, his servant, showing how righteous and good he is.
And then one of these angelic creatures approaches. He's referred to in Hebrew as the Satan.
The Satan? Who is this?
Well, this word is actually a title, which literally means the one who is opposed. So out of this whole crew, he is the one questioning how God is running the world. And he proposes that Job might not actually love God, that he's only a good person because God rewards him. If God were to take away all of the good things he gave to Job, then we would see his true colors.
So he thinks Job is just working the system?
That's exactly right. Maybe he's obeying just to get what he wants.
So God agrees to this experiment and allows the Satan to inflict suffering on Job.
And Job loses everyone and everything that he cares about. It is devastating. And remember, he deserves none of this. God himself said so.
The remarkable thing is that in the midst of all this suffering, Job still praises God.
At least for chapters 1 and 2. But then in chapter 3, we find out how he's really feeling inside. He unleashes this poem that reveals this devastation. It's a long, elaborate curse on the day that he was born.
After this, some of Job's friends come to visit him to offer their help. And all of them are like, Job, you must have done something horribly wrong to deserve this. After all, we know God is just, and we know the world is ordered by God's justice and fairness, so you must be getting what you deserve.
And for the next 34 chapters, the friends and Job go back and forth in very dense Hebrew poetry. His friends keep speculating about why God might have sent such suffering, and they even start making up lists of hypothetical sins that Job must have committed. But after each accusation, Job defends his innocence.
And Job is innocent.
He is. He's also on an emotional roller coaster. At some moments, he's very confident that God is still wise and just.
Yeah, in other moments, he's doubting God's goodness.
He even comes to accuse God of being reckless, unfair, and corrupt. So by the end of the dialogue, Job demands that God come and explain himself in person.
That sets out what's going on. So the seeming puzzle of suffering of the righteous and the apparent blessing of good fortune to the wicked was a problem, as pointed out there, addressed by various books in Hebrew scripture, particularly Ecclesiastes, and Ben Sirach is another one that we'll be looking at right at the end of the course. And its forms part of getting close to that intertestamental part of literature I've referred to. But none of these exhibit the radical protests and questions we find in the book of Job. And the book of Job lists a very large number of injustices that regularly happen to the righteous poor at the hands of the unscrupulous wealthy. So we find verses such as, "It is all one, therefore I say, he," that is God, "he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, God mocks at the calamity of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. God covers the eyes of its judges. If it is not he, then who is it?" And that's a very profound question that Job is asking there. And I imagine that most of us would not have the temerity to even voice such a thing as what's here, that the idea that God would mock at the calamity of the innocent. So the great misfortune which has struck Job, which included the stealing of his animals, killing of his servants, and destruction of his children, initially Job doesn't blame an unjust God. He still blesses the name of God. And the adversary, as the video points out, seeks to test God for the second time by an attack on his actual person. Again, God agrees to this attack, and Job is afflicted with terrible sores. He ignores the counsel of Mrs. Job, who says, "Why don't you just curse God and die?" And he does persist in his faith. Job does not attempt to explain the rationale for God's actions in regard to inflicting suffering. And while that might seem a commendable attitude, Job's question in 2:10, which is, "Shall we receive good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" raises some difficult issues for us. Does God send both good and bad upon humanity? Do both good and evil emanate from God? So, is it a ridiculous question? We're going to think about two quotes here. We have Deuteronomy 32:39. "See now that I, even I," that's God talking, "am he, and there is no God with me. I kill and I make alive, I wound and I heal." And in Isaiah, God says, "I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord God, do all these things." So in the Hebrew worldview, this was not an unfamiliar concept, and it may seem anathema to us. Evil had to be explained somehow, and it seemed reasonable to the Hebrew people that God both blessed and cursed, that God gave and God took away. And the Hebrew word for blessing and curse are the same consonants. It's blessing or curse depending on what vowels you put with it. So that illustrates how closely they saw the two concepts in relationship to God. So I'm going to pop you into small groups now, and we're going to discuss a question. Do you think the Hebrew people who wrote Isaiah and Deuteronomy and Job, are they right? Does God send both good and bad upon humanity, and what might that mean? So how did you go with this question? Does God send both good and bad upon humanity?
I think we've sorted it actually, haven't we, guys?
Oh, have you, Kate?
Yeah.
No. Okay, that's your answer.
Very
definitely no.
No.
I think we came up with the idea that there are choices. There's not always good and evil. It's actually choices which have consequences. And the other point that I made was, what's the other option? If we don't have a world where things can go wrong, we live in Disneyland. You know, it's a nothing world. Yeah. It's just everything rolls along. We have no idea. So that's just my perception on it. And
okay. Thanks, Kate.
I gave the example from my own experience living in Surrey Hills. The street I lived in went into Crown Street, which is one-way traffic. And at the end of my street, there was a sign saying turn left, all traffic turn left. If I turned right, I was in trouble. There were 6 lanes of cars coming up at me. If I turned left, I was fine.
One of the questions that was
in our
raised
group,
in the
in our
group,
group, Derek made a good point. He said, God doesn't send evil upon us, but nor necessarily does he send good upon us. We live in a world where good and bad things happen. They may or may not be designed by God. We live in a world of random happenstance, and when good things happen, we've got to be grateful for it.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Margaret, I think you wanted to say something.
we didn't get very far with our discussion, but the point that was raised in our group was the definition of good and evil is pretty hard to come by anyway, because that is a very subjective statement. What is good in one context will be evil somewhere else. So it's very hard to say what good and evil is.
Can anyone say that they
want to say
haven't
that's
got
not
God's
quite
good
right.
in the world?
What was that, Derek?
I say, can anyone really say that in their own lives they've never experienced God's good?
I suppose that depends on if they're a believer, Derek.
That God was on their side.
I mean, people say that, but again, it depends on how they believe and what their faith is. Someone without that faith would not say that probably. They'd see it as a random event. And with good and evil, if someone murders someone, I'm not sure that you can say that would be good in another case.
Yeah, okay, we haven't got forever to talk about this, but
some people need to be murdered, Elizabeth, I have to say.
It's an interesting question, because here in Job, it's God's decision alone to agree to test Job. Job has bad things sent on him because of God's decision alone. So just sit with that thought. We're going to move on to our next bit about looking at, is God safe?
So one of the questions that is raised in the long lamenting of Job in the earlier part of this book is this question: is it actually safe to be in the presence of God? Now, we, of course, assume, we take it as granted. We assume that God provides us with a safe haven, that God is a comforting God. But that was not the view of Job, and that view was forged in the intensity of the experience he'd had in losing all his family and possessions. The closer you got to God, the more danger you were in. Job's predicament, he believes, is precisely because he had become close to God and God was scrutinizing him carefully. So we're going to look at a comparison at this point. You may well know the beloved Psalm 8. When I look at your heavens, says the psalmist to God, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? You've made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. It's a psalm that says we can see our place in the whole scheme of things. The heavens show the magnificence of God. This is God's good creation. And yet, in that context, human beings have a very important place. We are not at the bottom of the heap. We are made a little lower than God and crowned with glory and honor. And so the psalm goes on, praising God for all the blessings that God has given to human beings. Now, those words, alongside of Job's lament in chapter 7, are quite potent. Job says, I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. And he says directly to God, what are human beings that you make so much of them, that you set your mind on them? He's echoing the words of the psalmist, which you can see side by side. He's deliberately resonating with that. What are human beings? Do you visit them every morning and test them every moment? Will you not look away from me for a while? Just leave me alone, God. I can't cope with you being here so close. Let me alone until I swallow my spittle. If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of humanity? Why have you made me your target? Why are you picking on me? Why have I become a burden to you? What is it that I've done? Why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? Again, echoing a classic Hebrew scripture line about what God can do. Now, for now, I shall lie in the earth. You will seek me, but I shall not be. Job descends into a really deep pit of despair out of his anguish about what he believes God is doing to him, and God is not keeping his part of the bargain in terms of redeeming him. God would much rather that God found mortals far less important, that God would go off and find himself other things to do rather than scrutinizing the life of Job and punishing him in this way. So he believes that to be watched by the divine was a fearful and potentially dangerous thing. And indeed, this is a consistent motif in Hebrew scripture, and it even runs through into our gospel stories where people Peter comes into the presence of God and falls on his knees. Depart from me, I'm a sinful man. Many people in Hebrew scriptures in Israelite times felt that to approach God was to enter into dangerous territory. Job feels that rather than being as a cloud that evaporates because his lifespan is brief, God is treating him like he is an enemy of cosmic proportions. So we're going to invite you to consider how Job's words about the injustices that he's experiencing and his blaming and pushing back towards God. We're going to invite you to think about how do those words strike you. And the letter to the Hebrews actually says it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And Job, in his lamenting, complaining, seems to be echoing that very, very clearly. Is it a fearful thing to fall into the hands of God?
So how do you find it? How do Job's words strike you? Is it a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, as the author of Hebrews would suggest? Yes?
Yes.
Anne thinks so?
Well, Jesus thought so too.
Ah, do you want to unpack that, Gary?
As he faced the cross, he said, take this from me.
Yes, yes, he did. That's quite true.
It's a theme right through the scriptures, isn't it?
Yes.
You can harden that rock while I pass by. Don't look at me, but when it's ready, I'll take my hand away and you can see my back.
Yes.
This sort of attitude is there all the way through.
Yes. And John was referring, of course, to the Gospel of Luke, where there's the catch of fish. That's the miracle at the beginning of Luke. And Peter falls to his knees and says to Jesus, go away. I'm a sinful man. He knows Jesus is a holy man, and with holy men comes the eye of God. Yeah. And if you're a sinful person, you don't want the eye of God on you especially. So that's why, if you've ever puzzled about that, that's why Peter says what he does.
Oh.
It's interesting because I think there's a lot of people, when they feel as though they have transgressed, they don't come back to the church.
Yeah, that's a good point, Gary. They feel that they're not going to be forgiven, that maybe the eye of God will be on them and they'll be punished. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, or maybe the eye of the church even.
Well, the eye of the church is more likely to punish them than the eye of God, in my opinion, but that's just my opinion.
I agree.
So that's how people think.
Yes.
Is it also the other way around, that we have that awareness of God? That is humanity's burden and joy. Whereas if I was my dog, I don't have any sense of in which the world is treating me well or not, except momentarily. I'm not aware of that greater. So it's we as humans that have that sense of the divine and of our own mortality that makes us, it's part of who we are. It's part of our privilege, but also our sorrow.
So being more aware means you're more likely to be more fearful because you are aware. Yep.
The question is still true. What is man that thou art mindful of him?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it comes up in a number of the Psalms, not just Psalm 8. We find it in other places where the human being is referred to like as brief as grass or a flower that blooms and then it's gone.
But isn't there a distinction between the predestined view and if you continue to cause social unrest, there will be a consequence.
Exactly. Yeah,
and
which is what I'm saying.
That's how I see it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. That if you do cause social unrest, you're running the risk of consequences. You might know their precise nature, but you know that there's a risk there, and it's not a small one.
That's right.
And the consequences with the Romans could be mightily unpleasant. And
How
that have been
popular.
demonstrated. We better move on. We're going to meet the first friend this week, Eliphaz, and Job's response to him. So after these first few chapters, Job has 3 friends that come. And they're Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite, who come to talk to Job about initially to comfort him, and they go to console and comfort him, but then they start to come up with these reasons why Job is suffering. And basically they represent the tradition and all the arguments of the tradition that would be used to say why good people do get rewarded and bad people suffer. And if Job's suffering, therefore he has to have some sort of hidden sin. So there would be comforting, and consolation does vanish quite quickly into accusations, some pretty bad theology, and some arguments about the character of Job himself. They quite wrongly conclude, and we know that they're wrong because God has said they're wrong, that Job's sufferings must be a punishment from God because of a great sin he has committed. And so these friends are used to expose the inadequacy of the doctrines of the tradition. And Job counters their arguments with some pretty stark arguments about what he sees as the current injustice of God. So you have a friend give a long poetic speech, and then Job will respond. And then the next friend gives a long poetic speech, and then Job responds, and that's how the next few chapters go. So we have friend, Job, friend, Job, friend, Job, until Eliuhah turns up at the end. So it's Eliphaz and the friends are saying you have a secret and hidden sin. Job is maintaining he does not. And Job then throws out a challenge to God to come forward and hear his case. So he's not getting anywhere with his friends. So Job wants a day in court with the Almighty. And he envisaged there will be a heavenly trial where he can put his case directly to God. There's lots of subtle word plays that go on in this dense Hebrew poetry with these speeches by the friends in Job. For example, Job does not know the way, the word the way in Hebrew, and I can't remember at the moment what it is, but it's thrown around a lot. Job doesn't know the way to God's abode, but God knows the way to Job, as he does to all human beings whose destinies he can control. Ironically, God also knows that Job has kept God's way. So we have this word pop up a lot, as is made clear from the beginning of the book. So Job throws out some pretty heavy accusations about God being completely unjust and not being fair, and Job wants to take him to court basically and say, this is the case and you need to answer me. What I want you to talk about in small groups now is, how do we understand affliction today? Do we think it comes from God? Where do we think it comes from? And are adverse circumstances God's way of testing us? So how do we understand affliction today, and are adverse circumstances God's way of testing us? Oh, well, how did you go with these very simple questions about how we understand affliction today, and are adverse circumstances God's way of testing us? Very straightforward.
Occurred to me in that if we have an omniscient God who knows everything and knows it in advance, why would God need to send afflictions upon us to test us? He doesn't need to test us. If he's omniscient, he knows how we're going to respond. So either God's omniscient or he's not omniscient.
Well, in this, I will ask you then, in the book of Job, is God omniscient?
No.
No, he's not.
No.
He has to test Job to see whether or not the adversary's punch is correct. Yes. So he's not omniscient in the book. Well, God, and an omniscient God creates a whole lot of problems theologically that we don't have the time to get into now.
That's right.
No, yeah.
An omnipotent God, which he clearly is in the book of Job, also creates a whole lot of problems.
That's right.
But he is omnipotent in the book of Job. So we know that about him. He can, make these decrees and do all sorts of things. And by the time you meet him in the cosmic whirlwind at the end, you'll see that is right, that he does consider, God sees God's self as omnipotent.
I was just going to say that in the group we were in, we didn't see affliction as something sent from God. We saw affliction as part of life, and how you deal with affliction will depend pretty much on your view of God and like how you see yourself in relation to God, but not as a punishment, not as anything else. It's how we live our life, how we view life overall. Not sent as affliction as not punishment. It can be circumstance, as one example was given to us. It can be all sorts of things. So we have a different worldview to start with.
Yeah. Anyone think adverse circumstances are God's way of testing us?
No.
No. We sort of became aware that sometimes things happen or things are sort of a result of a man's interference in some way, but it's the way you get the strength of God walking with you to actually deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes. Yeah. That's pretty much what we were saying, is finding God in life is the way we try to live our life.
Yeah.
I think it sometimes feels like God's testing us, like it's kind of a way of trying to work out why has this happened to me, and that there's injustice, and so sometimes it's just kind of a response. It's a response to what happens to you, and God can take it, chuck the blame at God. Yep.
It's our way of, almost our way of testing ourselves, because how do we react?
Yes, it is how we react. And how we react will depend on many things in our circumstances. It will depend on the severity of the adverse thing that's happened to us. It will depend on what faith we have. It will depend on the circumstances that we find ourselves in when this adverse thing happens. I mean, for a while there was in vogue, particularly in the New Age community, I think more than Christian communities, this idea that if you were afflicted, it was some divine way of testing you and that God never sent anything greater than you could handle. And, I'd like to say right now and here, I think that's rubbish.
That Pauline verse is a very hard one to come to terms with at times, because it's not true.
Yeah.
I just observe that the afflictions that come upon us, the dreadful things that happen in some of our lives, they're not sent to test us by God. What God does do is equip us to cope with them and to get over the tragedies that happen in our own lives and help us to deal with the disabilities and disadvantages that we suffer.
Yes. And people who have faith often live longer. They often recover better from certain ailments, like physical ailments and things. And presumably that's something to do with their state of mind and the fact they feel confident that that presence of God is with them. But that's been medically shown. People who are prayed for in intensive care tend to do a little bit better than people who aren't. And nobody can quite explain that by any kind of scientific thing, but the research shows that that's true.
The other question too, Elizabeth, is it comes down to how different people will see what, if something's bad's happened to them, what is bad for one person is not necessarily if it affected somebody else. They wouldn't see it that way.
And you'll see it from your cultural context. It's very different for us in the westernized world than it is if you're living in, you know, sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
Or if you're living on the Ivory Coast, or if you're living in really the impoverished areas of Pakistan or somewhere like that. It's a very different world from what our world is. And the affliction that you're likely to get there is very different to what we call affliction.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's what we were trying to say back in that first question. I used the words good and evil, which are a bit difficult, but circumstances can be either good or bad, depending on cultural things and all sorts of other issues. So it's really hard questions that we're asking. So it comes. Yeah.
And we need to think about that they're different. Sorry, who was that?
So from what you've said, Elizabeth, could we draw the conclusion that during the drought you wouldn't be praying for rain?
No, you can't draw that conclusion, because I think people did pray for rain. I don't think it was necessarily answered, because there's still some parts of the state that have seen no rain. And you've got to, and that's a different question. I mean, does prayer make the rain come? Based on the evidence, I'd say probably not. But does prayer affect people in intensive care? Apparently it does. I don't know why. Is it because the relative of that person stands by their bed and says, everyone in the church is praying for you, and somehow they can hear that even if they're unconscious? Because we know that people in comas do hear things. We don't know the reason. But you can pray for the fires to be put out by rain, like many, many did a couple of years ago, and they weren't. So I'm not sure of why certain things happen and other things don't, Norman. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't pray for them, but I'm saying to you, on this research evidence we've got, it is not more likely to rain if you pray for it. However, if people are praying for someone in intensive care, they're more likely to recover. There's a small statistically significant amount of a percentage there. Don't ask, as I said, I don't know why. It may be because people stand by the bed and say everyone's praying for you. What we have set up here is this age-old problem of what power and justice and injustice and good and evil and where it comes from look like. And those who have not been the victim of unjust power, whether it's divine or human-made, cannot appreciate the insecurity that capricious power and the denial of human rights generates. And that's what we're facing in this character with Job as he tries to grapple with this concept. It's a particularly disturbing story that we have set up there today. There is no doubt what has happened thus far to Job is completely unfair. Why should a blameless and upright man who feared God be allowed to suffer so, and at the hands of God, no less? And the only free will here, and thank God none of you brought this up, the only free will here that can be blamed here is God's. Because the decision to test Job was God's alone. And I'm going to leave you with some questions. So how can we believe in a God that apparently has such a dark side? A God who willingly strikes dead or allows to be struck dead the family of a person who only has God's goodness at heart, who has done no wrong. A God who allows this person to be afflicted with a dreadful disease and deprives him of his farm and the means to make a living. How can we hold to the idea of an all-loving God when these kinds of things happen, not only to Job, of course, but happen routinely in today's world? Now, we're not going to attempt to answer those questions today. I want you to think about them. And if you've really got the stomach for it, I'd like you to read the whole book of Job and have a go at it. It's long, it's dense, but it will be good for your souls. We'll continue the exploration of these and other questions over the next 3 weeks as Job appears on the lectionary. We're a week behind the lectionary because of the bonus canon session last week, but that's okay. Some of you will hear it preached. I can guarantee Tuggeranong people are going to hear it preached because that's exactly what I'll be doing for the next few weeks. And you can bring the questions the sermon raises into the session next week. Now, if you want to see a full overview of the book of Job, and it's not the video I showed you part of, there's another video that sets out how Job is structured and how its plot works its way out. Again, it's the Bible Project, and in your handouts, I've given you the link to that. So that's our introduction to Job, the darkest, most complex book of our canon of Scripture. And you might be asking the same questions. You might be asking more questions than you asked of Esther. How on earth did this book find its way into the canon? Because it actually raises more problems than Esther raises.